The Bible tells us in Exodus 15, it talks about Pharaoh's chariots and his host hath he cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea.
What they just found at the bottom of the Red Sea will make your blood run cold. An entire army, frozen in time, with evidence so shocking that scientists refuse to talk about it. Hundreds of golden chariot wheels, thousands of bones, and proof of an event that was supposed to be just a myth. But here's the terrifying part. As soon as they made this discovery public, the experts went silent. No interviews, no explanations, nothing. And now, the evidence is mysteriously disappearing. The expedition itself was unlike anything you'd typically see in mainstream archaeology. This wasn't a university-funded project with press releases and documentaries already lined up. Instead, it was a private operation.
So as a professor of theology and a student of church history, the Bible, and biblical archaeology, I'm fascinated whenever I see any kind of topic talking about biblical archaeology.
Backed by anonymous investors who reportedly poured over $10 million into the venture. The team included experienced deep-sea divers, many with military backgrounds, along with engineers and underwater archaeologists who were sworn to secrecy. They brought with them some of the most advanced underwater technology available. Equipment that most academic institutions could only dream of having access to. Their toolkit was impressive by any standard. They had military-grade, remotely operated vehicles, essentially sophisticated submarine robots, equipped with high-definition cameras, capable of filming in complete darkness. They used advanced side-scan sonar systems that could map the seafloor in incredible detail, and highly sensitive magnetometers designed to detect metal objects buried under sand and coral. This wasn't amateur hour. This was a serious, well-funded operation with a very specific goal in mind. For decades, amateur explorers and independent researchers had been making claims about a particular location in the Gulf of Aqaba, the eastern arm of the Red Sea that separates the Sinai Peninsula from Saudi Arabia. These claims were always the same. There were ancient chariot wheels down there, coral-encrusted and half buried in the sand. There were bones, both human and animal. There were the scattered remains of what appeared to be an entire ancient army. And for just as long as these claims had been made, mainstream archaeology had dismissed them completely. The scientific establishment called it pseudoscience, religious fantasy, wishful thinking by believers trying to prove their faith. But this new team had something the amateurs never had. They had the money, the technology, and most importantly, they had detailed maps and coordinates passed down from earlier explorers. The search began methodically. They established a grid pattern over a specific area of the Gulf and began scanning. Day after day, the sonar operator watched his screen as the pulses of sound traveled down through hundreds of feet of dark water, bouncing back information about what lay on the seabed below. Then, after what must have felt like endless hours of seeing nothing but natural rock formations and sand, something appeared. The operator noticed shapes on his prost screen that didn't fit the random patterns of nature. These were symmetrical, round, and most importantly, they were arranged in lines. Long, deliberate lines stretching across the seafloor. The team knew immediately that these shapes warranted closer investigation. Natural formations don't arrange themselves in straight lines. Natural formations don't have the kind of precise circular symmetry that was showing up on their screens. They deployed one of their remotely operated vehicles, sending it down into the cold darkness several hundred feet below their boat. The ROV's powerful lights cut through the gloom as it descended, its cameras sending back live footage to the team watching nervously on the surface. At first, there was nothing unusual, just sand, rock, and the occasional fish darting away from the mechanical intruder. But then, as the ROV moved forward following the coordinates from the sonar scan, something emerged from the sediment. It was round, perfectly round, and completely covered in a thick layer of coral growth. But underneath that natural coating, the shape was unmistakable. It was a wheel, an ancient, spoked wheel that had no business being at the bottom of the Red Sea. The ROV continued its survey, and what it found next must have left the team absolutely stunned. This wasn't a single wheel from some unfortunate shipwreck. As the robot's submarine glided forward, its mechanical arm occasionally brushing away silt, more wheels came into view, dozens of them, then hundreds. The sight stretched on, a debris field that extended for nearly 1.5 miles along the seafloor. Whatever had happened here, it had been massive. But finding something with a robot is one thing. Seeing it with your own eyes is something else entirely. The team made the decision that they needed to go down themselves. Elite divers prepared for what would be a challenging and potentially dangerous descent. The depth wasn't extreme by professional standards, but it was significant enough to require careful planning and monitoring. As these divers descended through the layers of water, dropping down into the cold darkness, the scale of what lay below became terrifyingly clear. The seafloor was littered with debris. This wasn't the scattered wreckage of a single ship that had gone down in a storm. This was something far more catastrophic. The divers found wheels everywhere, but what struck them immediately was the variety. There were wheels with 4 spokes, wheels with 6 spokes, and wheels with 8 spokes. To anyone familiar with ancient Egyptian military equipment, this detail is absolutely crucial. Different designs of chariot wheels correspond to different time periods and different ranks within the Egyptian army. 4-spoked wheels were older designs, while 6- and 8-spoked wheels represented later, more advanced technology used by elite units and royalty. Finding all of these designs mixed together in one location suggested something remarkable. This wasn't a collection of artifacts from different eras. This was a snapshot of an entire military force from a specific time period, all destroyed in a single event. The wheels were just the beginning. The divers found twisted pieces of metal that appeared to be axles, the long bars that would have connected pairs of wheels. They found rectangular shapes that could only be the remains of the chariot cabs themselves, now just collections of corroded bronze and petrified wood, all fused together by centuries of relentless coral growth. Coral, it turns out, will grow on any hard surface, and over thousands of years, it creates a kind of natural cast of whatever it covers. Even after the original materials rot away or corrode completely, the coral holds the shape. But perhaps the most sobering discoveries were the bones. Mixed in with the chariot debris, exactly where you'd expect to find them if this really was the site of some ancient disaster, were bone fragments. Lots of them. The divers reported finding hundreds, possibly thousands of pieces. Some were clearly from animals, specifically horses. They found skulls, ribs, and leg bones positioned exactly where they would be if the horses had been harnessed to the chariots when disaster struck. But other bones were unmistakably human. Pieces of spines, pelvic bones, fragments of skulls, all jumbled together with the chariot parts and the horse remains in a chaotic mixture that suggested sudden, violent death. According to reports from the dive team, the atmosphere down there was eerie. Multiple divers described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread as they moved through what was clearly an underwater graveyard. This wasn't just old military equipment that had been dumped or lost. This was the final resting place of hundreds, maybe thousands of soldiers and their animals, all of whom had died together in what must have been a terrifying final moment. Then came the find that nobody was really prepared for. One of the divers, sweeping a high-powered light across a large mound of coral, caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. Beneath the crust of coral growth, something was reflecting the light. It had a dull, unmistakable golden sheen. The implications were staggering. Among all these military chariots, there appeared to be one that was different, one that had been decorated with gold plating. In ancient Egyptian military hierarchy, gold-plated chariots were reserved for the highest-ranking commanders, or even the pharaoh himself. The team couldn't remove it. The coral had locked it in place over millennia, and any attempt to extract it would have destroyed it completely. But they documented everything. Thousands of high-resolution photographs, hours upon hours of high-definition video footage. They catalogued positions, measured distances, collected samples where possible. They knew what they had found was potentially world-changing, and they wanted to make absolutely sure they had the evidence to prove it. The question that immediately comes to mind when you hear about an ancient army at the bottom of the sea is simple. Why there? What makes this particular spot in the Gulf of Aqaba so special that it would be the location of such a catastrophic event? The answer to that question turns out to be just as remarkable as the discovery itself, because the geography of this location is absolutely unique. The Gulf of Aqaba is not your typical body of water. It's actually part of a massive geological rift system, the the same system that created the Great Rift Valley in Africa. This means that for most of its length, the Gulf is extraordinarily deep. We're not talking about a few hundred feet. In most places, the seafloor drops away into a vast underwater canyon that plunges down to depths of 5,000 or even 6,000 feet. That's well over a mile straight down into darkness. It's essentially a massive trench of water, a sheer underwater cliff that would be absolutely impossible for anyone to cross, whether they were on foot, or in chariots, or on horseback. The depth and the steep walls on either side make it a completely impassable barrier, except for one very specific place. Right at the location where the dive team found all those chariot wheels and bones, there's something that shouldn't really exist. There's a land bridge. Not a bridge in the sense of something built by humans, but a natural underwater plateau that spans the entire width of the Gulf. This raised section of the seafloor stretches for nearly 10 miles from the Egyptian shore to the Saudi Arabian shore on the other side. And here's what makes it so unusual. On either side of this bridge, the seabed drops dramatically into those 5,000-foot deep abysses we were just talking about. But the bridge itself, while still underwater, is relatively shallow. Now, shallow is definitely a relative term here. At its deepest point, this underwater bridge is still about 900 feet below the surface. That's not exactly wading depth, but when you compare it to the mile-deep canyons on either side, it's almost like a raised road cutting across an otherwise uncrossable chasm. The sonar mapping done by the expedition showed this feature in crystal clear detail. It's a distinct, massive pathway, several miles wide and 10 miles long, cutting right across the Gulf. And this is the only place in the entire 100-mile length of the Gulf of Aqaba where something like this exists. Everywhere else, the water is simply too deep. This is the only spot where an ancient group of people could have even theoretically attempted a crossing. The geography on land is equally significant. On the Egyptian side, right at the point where this underwater bridge begins, there's a location called Nuweiba Beach. It's a massive, sprawling beach area, but it's completely enclosed. On either side of the beach, steep mountains rise up, creating natural walls that make it impossible to go left or right. If you were standing on that beach thousands of years ago, you would have only two options. You could go back the way you came, heading west, or you could go forward into the sea. There's no other way out. The mountains see to that. This geographical setup is remarkably specific. You have a large, flat area where a substantial group of people could gather, completely boxed in by mountains with no escape routes except backwards or into the water. And right there, directly in front of that trapped position, you have the only possible crossing point in the entire Gulf. It's hard to overstate how unusual this combination of features is. Ancient writers describing events at this location couldn't possibly have known about the underwater bridge. You can't see it from the surface. You can't detect it without modern sonar equipment. Yet the geographical details they provided in their accounts point directly to this one-of-a-kind spot. The linear distribution of the artifacts tells its own story. That mile-and-a-half trail of wheels, bones, and chariot parts doesn't scatter randomly across the seafloor. It follows the path of the submerged bridge. The pattern looks exactly like what you'd expect to see if a large group had been caught in the middle of crossing from one side to the other. They were strung out along the route when something catastrophic happened, leaving their remains scattered along the path they were taking. The depth of the site also explains something crucial. Why are these artifacts still there at all? After 3,500 years, you'd expect everything to have been scattered by currents, buried completely by shifting sand, or salvaged by ancient divers and modern salvage operations. But the 900-foot depth has protected this site in multiple ways. It's deep enough that surface storms don't affect it. Ship anchors from passing vessels over the millennia couldn't reach it. Looters and treasure hunters throughout history couldn't access it with ancient or even relatively modern diving technology. The site has been sitting there, largely undisturbed, for thousands of years simply because it was too deep for anyone to reach until very recently. The unique currents created by those deep canyons on either side of the bridge have also played a role in preservation. These currents have trapped sediment on the plateau, causing sand and silt to slowly settle over the artifacts rather than sweeping them away. This gradual burial would have protected the items from further deterioration, while still leaving portions exposed or only lightly covered. Then there's the coral. The warm, clear waters of the Red Sea are absolutely perfect for coral growth. And coral has a very specific requirement. It needs a hard surface to grow on. Over the centuries and millennia since this disaster occurred, coral polyps attached themselves to every hard surface available on the seafloor. They grew on the wood of the chariots, on the bronze fittings, on the leather harnesses, on the bones. As the organic materials rotted away and the metals corroded, the coral kept growing, maintaining the shape of whatever it had originally attached to. What the divers are finding now aren't necessarily the original chariots themselves. In many cases, they're finding coral formations in the exact shape of chariots. They're essentially fossils, natural casts created by biology and geology working together over vast stretches of time. Without this specific combination of geography and biology, none of these artifacts would have survived. Any remains would have been scattered across the deep abysses on either side, dissolved by salt water, or ground to dust by shifting sediments centuries ago. But this location, with its protected depth, its sediment-trapping currents, and its perfect conditions for coral growth, acted like a natural time capsule. The land bridge also explains the sheer concentration of artifacts in one area. Military chariots weren't exactly compact. An Egyptian war chariot with its horses and crew would have taken up considerable space. Hundreds of them crossing at once would have needed a wide area to maneuver. But here's the thing about this underwater bridge. While it's several miles wide, it's still ultimately a bottleneck. You have an entire army, with all its chariots, horses, and soldiers, funneled into this relatively narrow 10-mile corridor. On a normal plane, an army could spread out, but here they would have been compressed together, unable to go left or right because of the deep water on either side. If disaster struck while they were in the middle of this crossing, there would have been no escape. They couldn't turn around quickly. They couldn't scatter to the sides. They were trapped on this narrow strip of relatively shallow seafloor with deep water on both flanks. This explains why there's such a massive concentration of artifacts in one place. It's not that the army chose to bunch together. The geography forced them into this position, and when catastrophe hit, it hit everyone at once. This geographical feature also helps address one of the main arguments that skeptics typically raise. When confronted with underwater archaeological finds, the default explanation is usually shipwreck. Ships have been sailing the Red Sea for thousands of years, and plenty of them have sunk. So, finding ancient artifacts underwater isn't necessarily unusual. But this site doesn't fit that pattern at all. Shipwrecks scatter cargo and parts of the ship itself, but they don't create linear trails of military chariots stretching for over a mile. Shipwrecks don't explain why you'd find hundreds of chariots, all from the same time period, all with design features specific to one particular army, arranged in a path along the only crossable section of the Gulf. The geography doesn't just support the idea that something happened here, it practically demands it. This location is too specific, too unique, and too perfectly suited to the ancient accounts to be coincidental. The underwater bridge exists whether anyone wants to acknowledge it or not. The debris field follows its path, whether anyone wants to explain it or not. And the artifacts themselves, coral-encrusted and ancient, sit there in the darkness, silent witnesses to something that mainstream archaeology insists never happened. The story of this underwater discovery doesn't actually begin in 2024. It begins decades earlier with a man who had absolutely no business being taken seriously by the academic world. His name was Ron Wyatt, and for most of his life, he was regarded as exactly what he appeared to be on paper. A nurse anesthetist from Tennessee with no formal training in archaeology, no university credentials, and no backing from any reputable institution. He was, by every conventional measure, a complete amateur. And yet, his story is now impossible to ignore, because the high-tech expedition that just verified the existence of this underwater site was following his map the entire time. Ron Wyatt wasn't your typical treasure hunter or adventure seeker. He was a deeply religious man who took the stories in the Bible absolutely literally. To him, these weren't allegories or moral lessons. They were historical accounts of real events that happened in real places. And if they were real, then they left behind real evidence. He spent much of his adult life, and a considerable amount of his own money, trying to find physical proof of biblical events. To the academic community, This approach was fundamentally flawed from the start. You're supposed to follow the evidence wherever it leads, not start with a conclusion and then go looking for proof. But Wyatt didn't care what the academics thought. He had his convictions, and he had his methods. In the 1970 seconds, Wyatt became fixated on the crossing of the Red Sea. The traditional theories at the time, and still today in many academic circles, suggested that the biblical Red Sea wasn't actually the Red Sea at all. Many scholars argued it was a mistranslation, that the original text referred to the Reed Sea, which they identified as one of several shallow, marshy lakes in northern Egypt near the Mediterranean coast. These lakes were maybe a few feet deep at most. You could wade across them without much difficulty. The theory was that the Israelites crossed through these marshes, and perhaps a shift in wind or tide trapped the pursuing Egyptian forces in mud. Wyatt rejected this theory entirely. He reasoned that if you actually read the ancient account carefully, it described something far more dramatic than getting stuck in a marsh. The story talked about walls of water on either side. It talked about an army with chariots being completely drowned, not just bogged down in mud. It described a body of water deep enough and powerful enough to completely annihilate a military force. That didn't sound like a shallow marsh to Wyatt. That sounded like a real sea, a deep one. So he started looking at geography differently. He followed what he believed were clues in the biblical text that pointed to a massive body of water, and his research led him south, away from the traditional sites, down to the Gulf of Aqaba. When he studied the area around Nuweiba Beach, something clicked. Here was a massive beach, completely enclosed by mountains. Here was a location where a large group of people could be trapped with no way out except into the water. And according to his research, somewhere out there in the Gulf was a shallow crossing point, even though he couldn't see it from the shore. His logic was straightforward, almost childishly simple. If this beach was where the Israelites got trapped, and if the sea parted to let them cross, then the remains of the army that chased them would be at the bottom of the Gulf, probably somewhere along that crossing route. So in 1978, Ron Wyatt did something that sounds almost absurd in retrospect. He got himself some basic scuba gear, chartered a small boat, and went diving. He wasn't funded by a university. He wasn't part of any official expedition. He was just a middle-aged nurse from Tennessee with a tank of air and a theory, and he claimed he found exactly what he was looking for. According to Wyatt, he discovered coral-encrusted wheels on the seafloor. He reported seeing what looked like chariot parts scattered across the bottom. He took photographs, though they were grainy and unclear by modern standards. He even claimed to have recovered a hub from one of the wheels, bringing it to the surface as evidence. On subsequent dives over the following years, he claimed to find more. He reported seeing human bones mixed with horse bones, all tangled up with the chariot debris. And then he made his most explosive claim. He said he had found and even filmed a golden chariot wheel, partially visible beneath its coating of coral. When Wyatt presented his findings to the world, the response from the academic community wasn't just skeptical, it was brutal. Archaeologists and Egyptologists tore him apart. They called him a fraud. They said he was seeing what he wanted to see, that his religious bias had completely clouded his judgment. They argued that coral formations can look like all sorts of things if you're predisposed to see them that way. His photographs were dismissed as showing nothing more than interesting rock shapes. His claims about bones were written off as natural debris. And the golden wheel? That was considered pure fantasy. But here's what made Wyatt an even bigger target for ridicule. The Red Sea crossing wasn't his only claim, not by a long shot. Over the years, he also claimed to have found the remains of Noah's Ark on a mountain in Turkey. He claimed to have discovered the real location of Mount Sinai, not in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, where everyone assumed it was, but across the Gulf in Saudi Arabia. He claimed to have found the remains of Sodom and Gomorrah. He claimed to have discovered the actual crossing point of the Jordan River. And most fantastically of all, he claimed to have found the Ark of the Covenant itself, hidden in a cave system beneath Jerusalem. To mainstream scientists, this wasn't research. This was a religious zealot on a fantasy quest, claiming to have found every major biblical artifact that had ever been lost. The sheer improbability of one person finding all of these things was absurd. It destroyed whatever credibility he might have had. His Red Sea claims got lumped in with all his other claims and dismissed wholesale. For over 40 years, the site was considered nothing more than wishful thinking, a hoax perpetrated by a true believer who wanted so desperately to prove his faith that he'd convinced himself he'd seen things that weren't there. Wyatt died in 1999, his claims still almost universally mocked by anyone with academic credentials. But before he died, he left something behind. He left detailed records. He left maps. He left the exact coordinates of where he'd made his discoveries. He left descriptions of the underwater land bridge and the debris field. And he left photographs and videos, poor quality by modern standards, but detailed enough to show what he claimed to have seen. The 2024 expedition team had access to all of this material. They studied Wyatt's maps. They reviewed his coordinates. They read his descriptions of what he'd found and where he'd found it. And then they went to those exact locations with their $10 million worth of equipment. They weren't diving blind, hoping to stumble onto something. They were specifically testing Wyatt's claims with technology he could never have imagined. And piece by piece, his claims started checking out. The sonar confirmed the land bridge, exactly where he said it would be. The remotely operated vehicles found the wheels. And not just random wheels, but wheels with 4 spokes, 6 spokes, and 8 spokes, exactly as he'd described. The divers who went down found the bones, both human and animal, mixed in with the chariot debris just as Wyatt had reported. They even saw what appeared to be a golden gleam beneath the coral, matching his most ridiculed claim. This puts the academic community in an incredibly uncomfortable position. For decades, they had held up Ron Wyatt as an example of everything wrong with amateur archaeology. He was the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when religious conviction overrides scientific method. Students were taught to dismiss claims like this automatically. Papers were written about the dangers of pseudo-archaeology, often using Wyatt as a prime example. Careers were built on debunking people like him, and now, advanced technology is confirming that the dismissed, ridiculed nurse from Tennessee was at least partially right about a massive underwater debris field at the exact location he specified. The experts, who spent years mocking him, are now faced with data that supports his core claims. The man everyone agreed was a charlatan appears to have actually found something real. This doesn't necessarily mean all of Wyatt's other claims are true. Each discovery needs to be evaluated on its own merits. But it does mean that the automatic dismissal he received, the ridicule and contempt, might have been premature. It raises uncomfortable questions about how the academic establishment treats outsiders, about how quickly inconvenient claims are dismissed, and about whether the gatekeepers of knowledge are always acting in the interest of truth or sometimes in the interest of protecting their own positions. Ron Wyatt can't be vindicated personally. He's been dead for over 2 decades, but his work, dismissed and mocked for so long, is suddenly demanding serious attention. The map he drew is proving accurate. The site he identified is real, and the implications of that are forcing a reconsideration, not just of this one discovery, but of how we decide what's worth investigating in the first place. So we have physical evidence of what appears to be an ancient army at the bottom of the Red Sea. We have a unique geographical feature that makes this the only plausible crossing point in the entire Gulf. We have verification of claims made by an amateur explorer decades ago. All of this raises one massive question that nobody can seem to answer satisfactorily. If there really is an entire Egyptian army down there, how did it get there? What actually happened in the Gulf of Aqaba thousands of years ago? The ancient account describes something that sounds completely impossible by modern scientific standards. It says the sea literally parted, creating a dry path with walls of water on either side. People walked across on dry ground, and then the water collapsed back onto the pursuing army, drowning them all. To most scientists, this is obvious mythology, the kind of supernatural event that simply doesn't happen in the real world. But the evidence suggests something catastrophic did happen at this location. So what could possibly explain it? One theory that's gained some traction involves a massive natural disaster that occurred around the right time period. About 3,500 years ago, a volcano on the Greek island of Santorini, known in ancient times as Pharaoh, erupted with devastating force. This wasn't just any volcanic eruption. It was one of the largest in human history, a cataclysmic event that essentially destroyed an entire civilization and sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean world. The explosion was so powerful that it would have created enormous tsunamis that radiated outward in all directions. Here's where it gets interesting. Tsunamis have a very specific and terrifying characteristic that most people don't fully understand. Before the massive wave hits, the water pulls back dramatically. This is called drawback, and it can expose the seabed for miles. To someone who had never witnessed a tsunami before, who had no understanding of what was happening, it would look like the sea was literally disappearing, parting to reveal dry ground where moments before there had been deep water. So the theory goes like this. A group of people are trapped at Nuweiba Beach with an army closing in behind them. Suddenly, triggered by the Pharaoh eruption hundreds of miles away, the water in the Gulf begins to recede. The underwater land bridge, normally 900 feet below the surface, becomes exposed or at least shallow enough to cross. It looks like a miracle. They rush across, moving as quickly as they can along this newly revealed path. The pursuing army, seeing their escape route, charges after them with their chariots and horses onto the exposed seabed. But the drawback is only the first part of a tsunami. The second part is the wave returning. Just as the Egyptian forces reach the middle of the Gulf, spread out along the 10-mile land bridge with deep water on either side, the tsunami hits. A wall of water, potentially hundreds of feet high, roars back into the Gulf with devastating force. The army, with its heavy chariots and equipment, has no chance. Within moments, everything is swept away and dragged down into the depths. It's a scientific explanation that fits many aspects of the story: the parting of the water, the safe crossing, and the sudden catastrophic collapse. Another theory, far more speculative, connects back to Ron Wyatt's other claims. Remember that Wyatt didn't just claim to find chariot wheels. He also claimed to have found the Ark of the Covenant. Some researchers have suggested these two discoveries might be linked. There are alternative theories that propose the Ark wasn't just a religious artifact but something far more advanced, possibly a piece of technology from a lost civilization or even something beyond human origin entirely. These theories suggest it could have been an energy device, perhaps something that could generate massive electromagnetic fields or manipulate forces we still don't fully understand. If you follow this line of thinking, the story changes dramatically. The Israelites weren't just escaping slavery. They were fleeing with something the Egyptians desperately wanted back, something of immense power and value. The Pharaoh wasn't chasing slaves. He was chasing a stolen weapon or power source. When the group reached the sea and found themselves trapped, this device was activated, somehow pushing the water aside through means we can't explain with conventional physics. The army pursued them into this artificial corridor. Once everyone was safely across and the Egyptians were committed to the chase, the device was deactivated or its effect collapsed, and the water returned with deadly force. There's even a theory involving acoustic technology, the idea that ancient civilizations understood the power of sound and frequency in ways we've lost. Some researchers speculate about the possibility of sonic devices that could manipulate matter, including water, through resonance and vibration. This would frame the staff mentioned in ancient accounts not as a simple wooden stick, but as some kind of acoustic resonator capable of generating frequencies powerful enough to affect large bodies of water. Again, this is highly speculative, but it attempts to provide a technological rather than supernatural explanation for the events. Regardless of which theory you find most plausible, they all point to the same conclusion. Something significant happened in the Gulf of Aqaba. Something powerful enough to destroy an entire army and leave its remains scattered across the seafloor where they've sat for thousands of years, slowly being encased in coral and buried in sediment. The evidence is there. The location matches. The artifacts are real. What's missing is a satisfactory explanation that both accounts for the physical evidence and fits within our understanding of what's possible. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. If this discovery is as significant as it appears to be, why isn't it front-page news? Why aren't universities scrambling to organize expeditions? Why aren't documentaries being made and papers being published? The silence from the academic establishment isn't just noticeable, it's deafening. And that silence might be the most revealing part of this entire story. For over a century, the consensus in Egyptology has been clear. The Exodus, as described in ancient texts, did not happen. at least not on the scale or in the manner described. This isn't just a minor academic opinion. It's foundational to how the entire field understands ancient Egyptian history. Textbooks are written around this consensus. Careers are built on it. The timelines, the king lists, the understanding of Egypt's power and military capacity during the relevant period, all of it assumes this event was mythological rather than historical. Now imagine you're a professor who spent 30 years teaching that this story is a myth. You've published books arguing this position. You've supervised doctoral students who've written dissertations based on this framework. Your entire professional reputation rests on this consensus. And suddenly, there's physical evidence that suggests you might have been wrong. Not just slightly wrong, but fundamentally wrong about something central to your field. What do? Do you immediately embrace this new evidence and admit that everything you've taught might need to be reconsidered? Or do you find reasons to dismiss it, to demand impossibly high standards of proof, to attack the credibility of those making the claims? For many academics, the professional cost of accepting this discovery is simply too high. Their careers, their reputations, their life's work, all of it would be called into question. So they stay silent. They wait. They hope the controversy will fade away, or that someone else will find a way to debunk it that allows them to maintain their current positions. But there might be something even more concerning happening beneath that academic silence. Some researchers have noted that the site appears to have changed over the decades since Wyatt first explored it. Comparing modern sonar scans to Wyatt's original maps and photographs, certain areas that were reportedly dense with artifacts now appear suspiciously empty. There are reports of drag marks on the seafloor, marks that suggest large objects were hooked and removed. The golden wheel that Wyatt claimed to have documented has never been seen again. There are no official records of it, no museum exhibits, nothing. It simply vanished. If this evidence is real, if it really does support one of the foundational stories of multiple world religions, the implications go far beyond academic embarrassment. This would be physical proof of a supernatural event, tangible evidence that would validate certain religious claims over others. In a world already divided by religious and political tensions, what would that do? How would it shift the balance of global power and belief? These aren't just academic questions, they're geopolitical ones. And history has shown repeatedly that powerful people and institutions will go to extraordinary lengths to suppress information they consider dangerous or destabilizing. Whether through academic gatekeeping, professional self-preservation, or something more deliberate and coordinated, the evidence at the bottom of the Red Sea remains largely ignored by mainstream science. The site continues to be eroded by currents and time, and if the reports of systematic removal are true, it may not remain intact much longer. The truth, whatever it is, might be disappearing even as we speak.